Hello, welcome to the 24th episode of Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Mark Cate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
This episode is about Nightbreed from 1990. Specifically, we're going to be addressing the director's cut that came out in 2014, but we're probably going to weave in the greater cosmology from the comic books. I can't believe either of us would be able to address the video games.
Yeah, I definitely, I didn't know they existed until pretty recently. I also not a gamer. So.
Yeah. And just to prepare you, our next episode, we are going to be talking about Death Note from 2017. Actually, this hasn't even come out yet. It'll probably be coming out about a day or two after this episode airs. It is a Netflix original film that we're just going to roll the dice and assume is worth talking about. So that'll be episode number 25. And without getting ahead of ourselves too much, we're not really an entertainment news podcast, but we just learned something super exciting.
Yeah, auteur horror filmmaker Tyler Perry is producing a sequel to Boo! A Medea Halloween, and it looks as ridiculous as the first one. Personally, I'm really excited about it because it's so goddamn silly.
If you're a Scary Thoughts podcast follower, you know that we both really, really liked Boo! A Medea Halloween, the first one. So, and you know, all sequels are good in my book.
Even Phantasm 2?
Nope. So we would love for you to rate and review, especially on iTunes, this podcast. We've got a lot of really great reviews and ratings up there right now. The more the merrier, the more we beat the algorithms, and the more people review it, the more people can hear it and find it.
Yeah, it's sort of like an American Psycho. Everybody's judged by their business card. For podcasts, the equivalent would be the iTunes review.
That's true.
Yeah.
And also, we do a newsletter with every episode with information about the episode, some memes, some recommendations, and you can sign up for our newsletter at scarythoughts.org. And one more little part of this preamble is that, spoiler alert, we are going to be talking about this film, not reviewing this film. So see Nightbreed absolutely anyway, and join us for this conversation happening right now.
Yay!
Okay, where do you want to start?
Did you see this movie when it came out?
No.
I did see it when it came out, and it made a pretty big impression on me.
How so?
Well, so when I saw the movie, at the movie theater, they had some just promotional swag, and one of the items was this little 12-page booklet that had a bunch of the monsters from the movie in it, and with little bios and descriptions, and it was so compelling a piece of horror, just ephemera to me, that I was totally taken in by it.
Yeah, it sounds great.
Yeah, it'd be almost like if you got a little Star Wars booklet that told you all the characters in the Mos Eisley Space Cantina, and then you just had a picture of them and kind of what was special about them and a little bit. And one of the neat things is some of the characters weren't even in the movie that I saw. They're in the director's cut, but the theatrical release, they're not in it because there was just so much cut out. And I went to go see this movie, and you hear a lot about how Morgan Creek, the production company that did this movie, and Fox, who released it, did this really shitty job where slasher films were super huge at the time that this movie came out. So they tried to market it around the character of Philip Decker as the main big bad of this movie, which he is, but this isn't a slasher film. There's slasher film elements to it. So you hear about a lot of how it was marketed as a slasher movie, but I didn't pick up on that at all. That wasn't part of my experience of the film. And so I went and was immediately taken in with the Danny Elfman soundtrack, and really, in my mind, would put this movie more in the line of a Labyrinth or a Dark Crystal or something that. There's just such fantastical elements. And I picked up right away that the monsters are cool and sympathetic, and that's what you want to be. And I just loved this movie from the first time I saw it in the theater.
Yeah, definitely. I didn't come to it until the director's cut, and because of that, came to it with a lot of the baggage of its notoriety and its mythology. Not the mythology within it, the mythology that the fans placed upon it. Mm-hmm. And I totally can see it. It's such an interesting movie. I think it's an unbelievably flawed movie, even at its best moments, and even if it in its best version, which I now have spent all this time researching the various incarnations. But there's so much there. Maybe too much, maybe to a fault, but it certainly makes it a really interesting movie, like a really satisfying movie to spend time with, because it really does give.
Yeah, and the creature effects are so interesting and unusual.
Yeah.
And, and they're juxtaposed against this, what is, a Canadian militia, which is hilarious, but it looks and acts just like American militia.
We'll get to that later for sure.
So it's playing this pretty obvious game of like who the monsters are. And it's like these beer swilling, like plaid shirted, like football fans or hockey fans, I guess, up there. And I don't know, it's just hockey in Canada, right?
That's all we have.
Yeah. And
Ringette.
And this was, I believe, Clive Barker's second directorial enterprise.
I think he did something else before that wasn't really...
Yeah, he'd done Hellraiser, maybe something in between, but this was considered like a pretty big bump for him budget-wise. Like Hellraiser was like a $900,000 film or something crazy like that.
I think it was 2, and this was 11 million.
This was 11, yeah. But this movie lost money initially. It only made like $8 million. And Clive Barker is said to have been really aware of what had happened to Stephen King, where Stephen King had full and total control of all of his books. He could write a fucking 1,300-page novel if he wanted to. But the films were just not consistently good, and there seemed to be nothing Stephen King could do to prevent like shitty versions of his books coming out.
Cocaine.
Yeah, cocaine. But Clive Barker wanted to get into the film game and have control, and in some ways Nightbreed is a classic cautionary tale of taking too much money. And it's sort of what a lot of the film directors I think we've been reviewing lately have really learned, is like there's a certain amount of money you don't take, because then you get the notes. And under a certain amount of money, you don't have to get the notes, or you could even find an interesting way to finance your film, like Range 15, like the Armed Forces zombie movie, totally fan funded. And Clive Barker took the money, the studio fucked it up.
Yeah, I feel like throughout this conversation, I'm going to be sort of weaving in observations about the way in which that may or may not be true. It strikes me that Clive Barker's baby here unquestionably got mutilated by the studios, but he had a deeply messed up film that probably someone looked at and said, like, this needs to be saved, and unfortunately the people who tried to save it had less business trying to make a film than Clive Barker. So they just made it worse rather than better. I mean, I think that all kind of contributes to what I love about the movie, is that it is big and epic and messy, and he bit off more than he could chew. And it's like the unmitigated Clive Barker, with all that money and control, made something that was too big, too out of control, had too many moving parts that didn't fit together. And the studio tried to rein him in and made it worse. But because he created this epic world and tried to tell too many stories and had too many emotional pendulum swings and all that, what we were left with, probably both in the original film and certainly the director's cut, is this epic world that you can sort of like imagine more into. You can think more about Midian and where it's going, and the way they set it up for a sequel. Obviously they did the like horror movie sequel setup, but I don't think it necessarily even needed that. It's just the very existence of this world building of Midian lends itself to being able to think about why that world and where it can go and what could happen next, and who are these other creatures, what are their stories, and what creatures are we not seeing, and how did they get there?
Yeah, it's interesting. He really, sometimes he talked about things being before their time. I mean, this was for sure way before its time. The whole idea of sympathetic monsters being the stars, like, which becomes a total thing in True Blood later on. In some ways, this is basically horror movie X-Men. You know, like there's these creatures with these like special powers, and they live in a special place. And I mean, although they would be more like the Morlocks in X-Men, like that are actually marred by their mutations and have to live underground. That's like a story arc from the Dark Phoenix saga.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, sorry, guys. Well, people know what that is. It's huge. It's a huge.
People.
Yeah, people know what it is. Like, anyway, but Clive Barker had imagined that this universe would reach and touch other film franchises. I mean, and later on the comic books that came out under a little side Marvel imprint. I think Epic is who put it out, but those comics link the Hellraiser universe with the Nightbreed universe.
Cool.
Like, and it's very, very cool. And so from there, you know, there's the kind of links between Event Horizon and the Hellraiser universe. So you're like, okay, there's this chain of franchise
that's cool.
possibility out there. And then the individual stories of the characters in Nightbreed, some of them are hundreds of years old. And the 2015 Nightbreed saga goes into like Pelican, who's like a fan favorite. He's the creature that has like the sort of dreadlocks.
Yeah.
You know, he is at least 150 years old and was killing people in southern Louisiana before the Civil War. You know, just stuff like that. So you're like, okay, what's this cool?
Well, that does overlap with True Blood right there.
Yeah, totally. Because he's basically, at the very least, at one point in his monstrous career, a swamp creature. You know, which is pretty badass. And he's sort of werewolfish, so maybe he's like a loup-garou, you know, which is like the French-Canadian werewolf creature. But, you know, all this stuff was written out and imagined. And, I mean, even as late as 2014, there's talks about this being a TV series.
Yeah.
Which is pretty cool.
They haven't closed that door.
No, and I couldn't find anything about it. It had been written in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
There's just it seems to have just completely stagnated.
I think it would be great, and I actually really would love for that to happen and be done properly, because I feel like I attach more meaning to this film than I think I get pleasure from watching it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. The concepts behind it, the ideas, the potential. I feel like this movie has so much potential that wasn't ruined by the studio. It actually just was never realized, period. Yeah.
Yeah, there are things about it, too, that it has a little bit of feel like David Lynch's Dune, that the subject matter and the mythology is just too big for 2 hours.
Yeah.
And, you know, and then you're dropped into, like, the storyline of this, which is, like, there's all this crazy shit that's happened off screen before, and then there's a link up to a direct sequel where the main character becomes basically a savior character. But this film isn't about any of this. This film is basically sort of like the Empire Strikes Back of this mythos. Like, it's where everything falls apart. Like, you know, the home is lost. All these really cool characters die, and at the very end, it's pretty tenuous. You know, they're like scattered. All the
yeah. I see what you're saying. That's true. But I think what this movie needed most in its writing stage, and at $11 million being this big budget, ultimately that's not a huge budget. And the movie does not look like a really expensive film. It looks interesting, and there's a lot of imagination that went into it. Mm-hmm. But even at the time, for its time, it's pretty janky looking in a lot of moments. However, you know, this is something we've talked about other films with their limitations, is that Clive Barker is a writer, and I think that the biggest problem with this movie actually is in the screenplay, is that it needed editing. We didn't need all of that shit to happen. It just created this chaos that didn't contribute to a deeper, more resonant film. It actually just made it confusing. And that's something that I think nobody can really say is not true, is that it's a very confusing movie. Even I can't imagine what the original was like if the director's cut is the one that is clearer.
Well, a lot of people talk about like, oh, it makes so much more sense now. I personally feel that like an off-the-street casual fan might even like the theatrical release better, because some of the stuff just isn't walked out. And I think that a casual fan, the creepiness of Philip Decker, some of the monster effects, and the just kind of general zaniness of like this crazy shootout ending it has might have been enough. Yeah. But this movie has really been carried through these various like reimaginings and rebuildings by a pretty rabid fan base. And so there's a little bit similar to like Joss Whedon's whole Firefly thing, that this fan base kept this thing going to the point where they made a weird cut called the Cabal cut, which they basically took all the VHS dailies or something like that and filled in the parts that had been removed. And that went around on the fan circuit for a while at conventions. And I saw it at a sci-fi convention like years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And just was like, oh my God, one day they're going to put this back together and it's going to be fucking great. And then that's what this new version is. And it's made for fans. You know, the things that are added in are things that I think would be interest, like his girlfriend singing, like that whole like weird like music number that happens at the beginning of it. I mean, that's such a 90s low budget thing. I mean, they even made a music video for it that you can find on YouTube.
Such a bummer.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, this movie was saved by fans, which is fantastic. But what I think is interesting about how that happened, and when I try to think about why that happened, is like, let's say Hellraiser. What do people like about Hellraiser? Like being really reductive. Well, Pinhead is fucking awesome. Like, and the idea of Pinhead and where does he come from? Oh my God.
Hell.
Yeah, that. But you know, like most horror films, we love Freddy, we love Michael Myers. That's often what the desire for the sequel comes from. We want more. What do we want more of? Well, we want to see more of that villain doing more of that villainy. However, with Nightbreed, it's not like, oh, I want to see Decker kill more families. It's like, I want more Midian. I want this sort of like displaced, non-centralized, outcasted world of monsters, because I think that, well, first of all, if you're invested in genre films, you're somewhere on the nerd spectrum, and you're probably self-defining as an outsider, and so it's really easy to identify with the breed, right? And that's essentially what Clive Barker was getting at. And, you know, he's a queer writer, and that was definitely part of what he put into this film, is that the Midians, the breed, are the sort of metaphor for queerness, for being gay and being outside and living in the closet and living in fear. And actually, I found this great review of Nightbreed by Walter Chaw, and he said, what his films act like are committed drag shows, empowerment melodramas, diaries of becoming, like if Cirque du Soleil ever did Grand Guignol. I think that kind of like sums up this movie pretty nicely. It is totally campy, and it's kind of totally horrifying, although it's never scary. Horror films at this point are rife with outsiderness as its main theme. I mean, you know, our first episode was about Stranger Things. That's about a bunch of outcast kids, right?
Yep.
And it's really interesting to place that at the center, but it's very hard. It was, you know, it was very hard to make a coherent film where there's this serial killer, but also this group of chaos villains that are sympathetic.
Yeah. The campiness too, it's such I think part of the DNA of this film is the film Freaks.
Yeah,
you know, it's
absolutely.
Freaks. Yep. And so you have this whole like, Gabba Gabba Hey, you're one of us sort of vibe for this film. And the Nightbreed, the Tribes of the Moon themselves are definitely freak showish, you know, even to the point where in the newer comic book, sort of pre-Midian, there's quite a few of them rolling around in a freak show carnival. So so these characters you understand are very like comfortable with this like performative monstrosity. Yeah. Especially, you know, some of the characters, there's a character Lude who looks like the blue-skinned Pan. He has like he's wearing like a really cool 1950s like Japanese bomber jacket. His character is like a god, basically. His father was like some Pan character, and his mother was like some girl, and he's like 700 years old. But he's also an acrobat, so there's a little bit of like playfulness with him. And then the character Shanasasi, the porcupine lady, like the woman who plays her, is like a modern dance performer or something like that. So there's a lot of footage of her like spinning around. So there's all these really neat performances of monsters performing, which I think made this movie maybe even more whimsical and dreamy. Yeah.
However, I think, I know I'm constantly like throwing out these negative critiques of this film that I thoroughly enjoy. But I think part of the failing of this film is that one of Clive Barker's complaints about the process of making this film is that the producers apparently couldn't get their head around sympathizing with monsters, and they just wanted to focus on it being a slasher film. Mm-hmm. However, Buttonface, David Cronenberg's character, Dr. Decker, is the kind of the best looking villain. Mm-hmm. He has the most direct impulses. You can sort of track his character. Mm-hmm. Whereas all the Nightbreed, they're all imaginative, but none of them are a pinhead.
Right.
Right? Like, none of them are just like, oh my God, I want a poster of that on my wall. Decker's slasher hood is pretty badass.
Yeah.
And Pinhead is like this amazing, iconic image. I feel like none of the Midian, like, what's his name? Kinski, the moon face, that just looks dumb. And like Pelican, like, okay, he's like kind of Rasta-ish looking.
Man, I think that's such a cool design for a monster.
All right. And then like saggy face in belly guy or eyes in cheekbones face. And like none of them are amazing. They're all imaginative, but none of them are bad, like singularly badass. It's just sort of like a wash of weird, which again, there's a way in which I totally appreciate that.
Yeah.
But it's not like the X-Men, right? Where each of the individual X-Men are sort of like singularly incredible.
Yeah, I wonder. Okay, so what I wonder is if you had picked up like X-Men number like 172, like right in the middle of like Danger Room.
That's not my favorite issue, but
well, just kind of like midway through the Dark Phoenix saga. Okay. What I'm getting at is I wonder if you just read like 3 issues like around then, like 172, 175, without knowing any of the backstory of the characters or really much of what they were capable of totally, if you would have a similar experience. Because I have the exact opposite opinion about these characters, and I think it might be because I've read so much of the secondary material that that I'm really familiar with, like, why does that guy have a face shaped like a moon? Like, it's a pretty cool backstory.
Right.
And so some of that stuff, it's hard for me to know if I would feel the same way if I hadn't read all that stuff. Like if I had only seen the director's cut of this film, would I have the same experience you did? Probably, but I remember thinking Pelican was like the coolest looking character when I was a kid. So maybe,
In all that, I have a question. What do you make of the Berserkers? Because they for me are sort of the RZ reader. They're sort of like, we're sympathetic to the characters in this world, and some of them are genuinely very violent, but mostly they just want to be left the fuck alone. But then there are these berserkers who just kill everything in their path, and they're part of it.
Yeah. Well, so the berserk, I mean, how they got there, who would have like even thought, like the idea of like we should probably keep these things around instead of euthanizing them is pretty crazy, because it's like, okay, you have to at the very least deal with cages full of incredibly destructive monsters.
Yeah.
But one of the things I like about it is these aren't simply like weird looking characters who have magical powers and are misunderstood. They are like literally monstrous. Like, like Boone is unable to control himself around fresh blood. They are monsters in the very real sense. Like next to humans, one of the reasons why the Tribes of Moon, some of them are executed, is because they fucking kill humans. Like they like steal babies and eat them and shit. And some of them are very innocent and they didn't do anything wrong.
Like Babette.
Yeah, like Babette, or like the character Anaka, who's the one that explodes in the sunlight.
Oh, he's my favorite.
Yeah, and that's an interesting character because
he looks like he's headed to a psychic TV show or something.
Yeah, his backstory is really peculiar in that his tattoos that are on his body were put there by angels. Oh. And one of the reasons why he's a little angel. He's a little angel. And one of the reasons why he is allergic to the sun is because these angelic beings didn't want his tattoos to be visible to people. And I guess he's old enough to have lived by torchlight or something crazy like that. That character adds a little bit of hint of queerness to this film in the way that like Narcissus has like this little flirtation with him, and he like rubs his chest. He's like, "Oh, sailors," and I think, and then the way the cops deal with him is very much, you know, like how. Like,
well, the first attack on a Midian is, I think, a cop rips his tit ring out.
Yeah, totally right. You can imagine.
I think that's the first act of violence against them from the cops.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. And there's all these like little subtle things, like, you know, he reaches his hand out to the black cop, and the black cop steps away from him.
Yeah.
So there's all this subtext here. You can imagine all of this standing in for like how New York cops dealt with gay patrons in the 70s or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, and it's all there. And then Clive Barker has said as much. You know, that's what this movie is about.
Yeah. And also that's about touching, and we're talking about 1990, like AIDS was still like destroying gay communities, and there was still so much disinformation about how it was transmitted and everything, and there was definitely like, you know, homophobia in its truest sense, phobic fear of, that this movie has that subtext, I think, lying across it as well.
Yeah. What do you think about the character Boone? Like, he's the main character, and the idea of him as the Messiah, even after reading all of the side materials or stuff, it still doesn't make very much sense to me.
Right. I mean, it's still a little bit like white man saves the Indians, white man is the last samurai. Mm-hmm. He's still sort of like, it's telling this story of outsiders, but he is like, even when he is transformed with all the sigils all over his face, he's still clearly like a model. You know, he's still sort of like a James Dean bad boy leather jacket, white t-shirt, perfectly coiffed hair. And he's also the newcomer. I mean, I think complaining about the story and its structure, or the way it functions again, I think that something I've talked about on previous episodes with other movies, where a lot of times movies have these like built-in excuses for how things might not work. And I think that when the trope of it has been foretold is used, I feel like half the time that gets said in a movie, it's just as bad as shitty exposition. Mm-hmm. It's just a way to get the plot from A to B without actually having to do any heavy lifting. And so Boone is the Messiah. It's Boone's fault Midian is destroyed, but it was foretold, so that's cool. And he's gonna save everybody anyway. He's supposed to relocate them, like, and he's not really an outsider. I mean, he's just this mechanic who has nightmares, you know?
Yeah, in the comic books, it walks out his story, and he goes through like some pretty crazy abusive shit as a young child, and at one point I think he like, his father is like beating his mother to death, and he like stabs his father in the head, and then the mother dies, and then so he's off into foster care, and he's like horribly abused and stuff. So he has like all of his nightmares and things are there, and then he also has these like future dreams of, you know, the tribes of the moon and stuff like that. But he's never like a bad person. Like he like when Pelican, you know, he's like, you're natural, I can smell it on you. You haven't killed anybody.
Right.
And then at this point in the mythology, Pelican's body count is like in the hundreds. Like he's pretty much like kind of like the Lestat of the Nightbreed. He's just fucking being a monster and like totally enjoying it.
Right.
And the character Kensky, who has the moon face, is sort of a fundamentalist of the law. Like even in the film, he's like, well, we can't violate the law. And he's kind of like a buzzkill in the comic books. He's always keeping all these characters from just monstering out and murdering humans. But yeah, I think for me, there's so many things that I let pass, but the things that just the plot holes and things just don't make sense, or things that are like, why is this even a thing right here? Like, are like 50 people really going to go be stoked to go murder a bunch of kids in a graveyard? I mean, it's just super weird.
Yeah. Well, yeah, speaking of that, it's funny. I think that a lot of that was done with reshoots, the like load up on guns scene. And it feels very much like the weakest moments of a Romero film. The sort of like heavy handed, like
the training montage. Or like when they go get all their shit.
Yeah.
And like they make the chainsaw broom, you know, or like whatever.
But like, it's like, okay, am I imagining it, or is there like snare rolling and flutes while they're loading up on guns in this movie?
I mean, there may as well be.
Okay, yeah, it almost doesn't matter. It's that. It's like, it is so cartoonish that it works against its own message. It does not make a case against crazy militias because it is such an absurd crazy militia that doesn't exist. Like where 50 locals are just going to charge blindly into a cave that has like monsters in it. And even to the point where, the Hill Street Blues actor, the guy who leads the charge, is like trying to shoot his own men in the back for running away from the exploding cave. Like,
yeah, it's absurd.
It's weak.
Yeah.
It's not good filmmaking. It's not good writing.
Yeah, just weird things too. Like the whole jailbreak sequence seems just extremely long.
Yeah.
And unnecessary, and it's just so weird. But it does introduce a few things. It doesn't introduce them because it's late in the film, but it exemplifies some of the stuff that's so neat about this film. Is like, why is he driving a 1954 right side drive weird European Mercury ripoff?
Right.
Like it's just an odd car to have in
It reminds me of Near Dark somehow.
Yeah, there's definitely a Near Dark feel to it, and there's so many choices of just stuff in the background. They're just quirky and interesting. Like the scene where the woman drops the donut on the ground and she's eating it. It's so strange how long and visceral her plopping this cake down on this table is, and then a moment later there's a head, so it sort of ties that together. But she's like licking her fingers and saying she's grossed out.
I wanted to bring up that reminded me of what Monique in our Black
the
Swan,
trash cake,
the garbage cake.
Yeah, garbage cake.
It's like, is floor pastry the same as garbage cake? Sure, like Monique's saying, like, well, everybody's eating garbage cake, and you and I are like, what are you talking about? Then there's a movie where a woman's like scraping the filling out of a pastry.
Yeah, I thought about that same thing when I was watching it again recently. Or like, okay, in the scene where Decker pushes Boone down and he falls on the knife and the table, and he pulls the card table off, and there's like an ace of hearts stabbed perfectly into his chest.
That's pretty good.
It's just goofy, just weird, quirky filmmaking. Sometimes there are moments in this film, because of the trees and some of the odd choices of acting and Boone's costume, that it reminds me of Twin Peaks. There are like these really similar feels, and then the music is so bizarre and good.
No, it's not.
You don't like this Danny Elfman soundtrack?
Okay.
It's like budget Batman soundtrack.
God, I think the soundtrack is so terrible.
Really?
I think it is. Danny Elfman's done a lot of really interesting soundtracks, and I think that him applying his zany too many notes thing is really at the detriment of this movie. And there are two scenes in particular. One is the like hallucinatory psychedelic sex scene is like cartoonish and goofy. And then when Laurie first goes and explores Midian, it's this really rad scene, and it's all this like totally carnivalesque goofball sort of Arabic sounding music, and it makes it silly. It makes it like a Looney Tunes animation instead of this creepy other world. But while we're talking about music, I really want to talk about Johnny Get Angry.
Yeah.
So a lot of people online like seriously hate on the addition of that entire number, which it's too long. Like the performance of an entire song has to be pretty fucking special to include it in its entirety in a movie.
Yeah.
And this, it's fine.
You don't even get a full version of Saxman's I Still Believe and Lost Boys. Like even they keep it short.
Right. And Boone leaves the club, so he could have left midway through the set, and it would have made perfect narrative sense. So there was no reason for the editor to include it all. But what I found especially weird about that scene, and maybe this is sort of maybe for my other podcast, Why We Listen, these kinds of concerns, but okay, you know the trope in a movie where they'll cut to a new scene, and someone will say like, and that was the last time I ate clam chowder, and the boardroom erupts into laughter. And it's such a cliche because the writers can have a joke, have a light moment without actually writing a joke, not have a character actually go through the process of telling a joke. And then because we as viewers know what's funny, we know what a joke is, and shitty joke is a shitty joke. And the only time jokes are ever said in movies is when they suck. Mm-hmm. And the joke is that it's not a funny joke. I think that music performances, rock music and pop music, are so embedded in the lexicon of who we are as at least Americans or Canadians, in the case of me. So this Johnny Get Angry scene, mm-hmm. the whole crowd is clapping along to this not clap along song, mm-hmm. and they're not even clapping in time to the song. So there's this disruption with what we know to be good rock and roll and how the crowd is reacting to it.
Yeah, you sort of like immediately distrust the people that live in this world.
Exactly.
Because you're like, okay, if you guys like this, then you're not humans.
Well, okay, so it could be like, oh, small town, we all go to the club, it's crowded. It's a perfectly good band. There's nothing wrong with that band and her
friends
singing.
From work come out to support Lori.
Totally.
Maybe meet her boyfriend that they've heard so much about.
Totally. But like they cut and everybody's like clapping and excited and like just they're having to. We know how much fun a local band show is, and it's not like that.
No.
And that always bugs me in movies and TV shows. At least like in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, whenever they're hanging out at the Bronze and there's some sort of like B-stage Lilith fair or post-grunge act happening, everybody's just kind of like standing around nodding their heads looking cool because that's what people do at shows unless the music is like punk or metal or techno, It's like trying to force more activity in the scene than would really happen, and it makes it awkward. Anyway, I took too long to say that.
Yeah.
Because it really upset me.
So, final judgment, not down with the song in the middle of the movie.
I didn't mind the song. I just didn't. I just wish that it was what it was, which is like, pretty good local band.
Yeah. Even in the comics, they try to make a big deal out of her, like her Nightbreed power that she eventually gets is that she can do something with music. It's I can't even tell quite. Like she can like play on a guitar and then
is she like Dazzler from the?
It's a little bit like that. Like she can sort of like sway people's emotions a little bit with her.
Does she have roller skates?
She does not have roller skates.
I'm not interested.
Yeah.
In.
But I mean, who knows? But how she even becomes a Nightbreed is kind of weird. It's like she kind of like does the thing that everybody does in a vampire movie, which is like, fuck yeah, I don't want to be a vampire.
Yeah.
She's like, hey, take me with you. And he's like, no, I'll be gone for a while. I'll have to find these monsters a home. And she's kind of like does the math that most people would do in a vampire movie. Like, okay, well, you could be like young forever and I'll be old. You're not coming back. So I'm going to stab myself and make you turn me into a monster.
Right.
Which is a pretty smart move. I think a pretty good move.
Right.
Yeah.
However, I'll run out of naysaying soon, I'm sure. But that scene sort of typifies the problem of this movie is because there are like 10 emotional swings in that one scene and we only needed one. Well, it's like, this is happening, and then she does this, and then he says this, and he's going to leave, and then she says, go away, and then she stabs herself, and he's like, no, in the silhouette, and then he bites her, and then maybe she's still dead, it was too late, and then she rises up, and then they hold each other looking over the horizon, like, too much, calm the fuck down, and we aren't invested in that relationship enough. Like, it starts as a love story, and like, the whole thing about Cabal and this movie is that it starts with, I'll never leave you. Or you said you'd never leave me in the movie. But they don't give enough weight to the love story for me to give a shit what's going to happen in that scene. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, part of it's like you wonder what was she, what's so special about this guy, or like how she, he's. I think in the book he's like schizophrenic. Like he
looks great with his shirt off.
That's the whole deal.
And that we get that in this movie many times.
Yeah.
That is a featured part of this movie.
Like he's a bit grungier in the book too. Like it mentions that he'll like go days without shaving or showering or whatever. But he's kind of like a pre-grunge character in some ways. With his goofy leather jacket and mullet and whatnot.
Yeah.
But yeah, like in that scene, it's so artificial. It has like this Gone with the Wind back fade in a cornfield sort of shoot, and you're like, what is this? Is so goofy, or like a wheat field rather. And then the next scene, they return to like a barn, and it's like staged like a manger scene. And it's kind of interesting. They have like this like light hitting Babette right in the face. So to me, the way that scene is shot, it makes it almost like Babette is really the character that is, going to be this eventual savior, and he's just like maybe this like John the Baptist character that comes before and like gets them to where they need to be. But speaking of the prophecy that we're talking about, did you know that Ralph McQuarrie did The Wall? So Ralph McQuarrie did all the concept art for the original Star Wars.
Oh, I did know that. Yeah.
So and
I did like that wall.
The wall.
I don't like the whole prophecy bullshit, but it looks great.
Yeah, it's a really cool way to open, or at least it looks great in the opening in the film. But I guess it was on one of those like turn and burn. It is Pinewood Studios is where it was shot, and they just like cut it apart with a chainsaw and threw it in the trash after it was over. And I guess Clive Barker was like completely devastated by it.
There was also another sort of the inverse of that. There's a little anecdote about how they were shooting the Batman movie, the first Batman movie, at the same time on the same lot. And they, $11 million was a lot of money, but it wasn't that much money. So they were trying to figure out ways to bulk up the graveyard. And I guess they found some gargoyles lying around like in the dumpster at the lot. And they went and got them. But some of the prop guys from Batman saw it. They're like, what are you doing with those? And they're like, we're going to put it in our new movie. And the prop guys just like destroyed them with sledgehammers so that Nightbreed couldn't have them.
Dickheads.
So good. I want to go back to talking about Boone because despite the fact that he's a cliche in a lot of ways, white t-shirt, car mechanic, leather jacket, silly hair, brooding, big jaw, it's a cliche, but it's a cliche that gave us, let's go back to Buffy, gave us Buffy and Angel. And I think that Buffy and Angel, there's a lot that inspired Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but I gotta think a lot of it was Nightbreed because, Decker is turned, she's not. There's the issue of forever versus going to the young blonde woman who's going to age, but their love is forever, but only one of them will live forever. Also, Lost Boys has the big jaw vampire guy. Something else you mentioned, True Blood.
Yep,
very similar. Even Twilight. I mean, he's Patterson isn't by any stretch a sort of like rocker leather jacket guy, but he's still like handsome, brooding, big jaw vampire in love with a human.
And he could be a rocker for his time. Like he could be a bass player for the Strokes or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, that's fair.
So, yeah.
But I feel like that trope really perseveres. It wasn't invented by Nightbreed, but I gotta say there's a lot of that couple, a lot of that character and that couple that came afterwards.
I mean, to me, it's all James Deanish. You know what I mean? You have this sort of like, this character that could have been the alpha male if he wanted to be, but chooses not to. Like the older brother in The Outsiders that Patrick Swayze plays. Like in The Outsiders, one of the things that mentions is like he lifts weights and played football for 2 years, and that's why he's so cool. Is like he's not just he's not just a greaser. He's this greaser that could have been associated. Like so, there's this like kind of strength in renouncing this, the rights, all the rights and benefits of having a square jaw and abs. Like he's sort of turns away at them,
right,
or something. I don't know.
I want to go back to talking about the armed militia, crowd. There was something particularly Canadian about that scene? Well, there are a lot of things about this movie that strike me as being particularly Canadian, but I think that it's funny that this just didn't just feel like an American critiquing gun culture in America. It was a British person shooting a film in Canada that felt like it was critiquing American gun culture. And that's a thing Canadians do, because Canada is not like that. Like, Canada is absolutely in the shadow of America and a big difference between the two countries is its relationship to guns. But this movie takes place in Alberta. That scene makes no sense in Canada. It's cartoonish even if we thought it was taking place in the US, but Canadians don't have that many guns, have that relationship to guns. It's just absurd. And I think it's funny to think of to picture a bunch of Canadians grabbing semi-automatic weapons to go and lay siege to a cemetery.
Yeah, it's super silly. I mean, one of the things that's exceptionally silly when they're gearing up is one of the actors, the guy who gets it in the face with all of the Porcupine Lady's needles. He's like the one who's kind of talking about all their weapons. And at one point he holds up the garrote. He's like, and if everything else doesn't work, there's the garrote. And he's like licking it. Like, what is wrong with you? You're just like a super pervert, And that's one of the things that's kind of funny about this film is that all the people who are traditionally respectful, like the sheriff, the doctor, the deputy, like all these people are the real deal freaks of this film.
Yes.
Like they're the most mutant. And like the preacher is perhaps the strangest character, but the worst acted. Like that actor is just terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
However, for me, one of the best parts of this movie, but at the same time is yet another sort of outlier, is Cronenberg's performance of Decker.
Yeah, hands down,
so good.
It's an all-time great villain performance, in my opinion. I mean, it's so different the way it's paced and how he performs his character. It's just weird.
However, nobody else in the movie is making choices like that.
Nope.
So it's kind of like I sort of wish other actors or Clive Barker directed the rest of the film to take a cue from stylized acting. I mean, it makes sense with him because he's supposed to be this detached sociopath who's only delivers empathy or empathetic sounding voices when he's trying to get something from people, like yelling he's got a gun. But not everybody could kind of play so extreme, but everybody else in the film is just sort of playing. It's kind of TV acting. It's it's functional.
No, the guy who plays Narcisse is pretty great. Or I've heard.
Oh, I'm not saying bad. I just mean functional.
Well, I mean, even like I see what you're saying about the functional. Like his choices make it more than just a slasher. So you wish in the movie it was more than all this other things. Like why couldn't more actors have done a little more of what they were?
Yeah,
and
Narcisse did. He made some. Some of his lines are very peculiar.
Yeah, it's one of the only bummers about the director's cut, and it mirrors the book. Is that he doesn't die in the theatrical release. Like he actually survives, and it's a cool character. So it's too bad he ends up dying.
And apparently something that was cut out a lot of for the director's cut from the Cabal cut and maybe the theatrical release is there were more sort of like taglines, and the ones that exist in the director's cut I think are all excessive. The guy who has the snakes that come out of his belly, everything out of his mouth is dumb. It's never funny.
Yeah.
It's all and it's not like funny campy funny. It's just kind of awkward and unnecessary. And unfortunately Boone has that save the last dance or whatever he says when he like kills is it Decker?
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's goofy. Yeah, there's lines like that. They're just silly. And then this multiple characters because of overdubbings and different actors available at different times.
Yeah.
Several characters' voices change throughout the movie because there's different overdubs. And that's just another thing of this movie that's just fucked up. I mean, it's just the way it is. I think if you really want to go deep into this movie, you cannot do better than the Clive Barker cast. Like it's a podcast. It's about Clive Barker. And so a lot of the trivia that I've picked up from this movie really comes from those guys and their webpage and stuff. So and they have a lot of really great information about behind the scenes, like what actor did what and why and all this stuff. And then the guy who plays Lylesburg, the Moses-y character with the eyes in his cheeks, is Doug Bradley, who plays Pinhead in Hellraiser.
Right.
And his voice is fairly emotive, but they get this weird German guy to like overdub
so weird
in the original version of it. And the guys on the Clive Barker cast say something pretty funny. They're like, well, they just imagine some coked up producer being like, Lylesburg, German, get a German voice actor. Like that's a totally like cynical version.
Oh yeah. What else we got?
Well, I think you can see the legacy of this film in quite a few other more modern horror films.
Yeah.
You know, just the idea of interesting monster design or sympathetic monsters, or in an American Horror Story, a lot of times the characters that are like cops or whatever, they're kind of the bad guys. And
Right.
yeah. And then, you know, this universe expands outwards. Like Rawhead Rex is sort of a part of, it's like this really shitty horror movie that is based on a Clive Barker novella or a short story. There are all these little things, I think, in other movies that are inspired by, or maybe even connecting to Nightbreed.
Yeah. Who doesn't love an underdog?
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a way in which this movie, by asking us to reconsider the concept of monstrosity, actually unrolls a fairly postmodern idea of what morality is and can be.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think that this movie very definitively attempts to rewrite the idea of a meta-narrative. Like, that's what it is. That's what the Nightbreed are, is a subversion of some sort of idea of dominant narrative. And rather than with, let's say, Hellraiser, we've got this whole world that is patently evil. It's seductive, and it conflates pleasure and pain, but it's still clearly evil, right? There's a confusion and a conflation.
Talking about in Hellraiser?
Yeah, in Hellraiser. Whereas in Nightbreed, there's far more slippage and there's far more sympathy. And even though there are the berserkers, even though there are the berserkers, and even though they are monsters who, some of whom do want to kill humans and each other, probably one would think, this movie asks us to reconsider not just who's an outsider, but morality itself, I think.
Well, yeah. I mean, the whole idea of just their god being Baphomet,
right?
You know, it's which is never explained, never talked about. Clearly, not the same Baphomet that.
No, that's a weird thing about this movie is that, and the book is that it uses the name Baphomet, but that's not Baphomet, and it uses, you know, the place Midian, but it's not Midian from the Bible. It's some other Midian, and even like his name is Cabal. Like, it's okay. You can just randomly repurpose that word, that name. Odd.
Yeah, and there's so much significance to the name. Like, you are now Cabal. Okay. Great. I mean, and that's I think one of the things that
I'm glad it wasn't named Cabal, because that would have made that moment like, oh God, like were we working? That's what we were working up to, but because it wasn't called that, it was just a weird moment.
I share your feeling that the studio might have not been all villainous in this, because it was their decision to call it Nightbreed, and I think Nightbreed is a much cooler name than Cabal. I mean, like Nightbreed sounds badass. It's just such a cool. And it's exactly what it is. You know, it's the only way they could have been more explicit is have called it like Tribes of the Moon, you know, or something like that. You know, like the whole franchise and all the comic books and stuff is equally as uneven as this film is. It seems like there might be something to, you know, like when a story gets a little far away from the Robert McGee 3-act structure, and like you get away from a hero's journey and stuff like that, the Western brain doesn't really find it satisfying. And I've read a ton of Clive Barker novels, and there are elements of them that are clearly superior to Stephen King's novels. Like, just some of the ideas and some of the writing is much better. But none of them are as satisfying as a Stephen King novel. Like, not a single one. I mean, I've probably read like 15 to 20 Clive Barker books and novellas. And none of them give you that like pleasure feeling that like Stand By Me does, or It does. Like that like comfortable, like all is right in the world, even when it's going bad, because it's just off and it's weird and it's, I mean, queered might be too strong of a word, but for this,
it's totally fair.
Yeah, I mean, there's just this kind of oddness to the ideas of this, and then some people I think work well with the source material, and some people don't. Like the comic book that came out in the late '90s or mid '90s has some really cool stuff in it. Like the dude that did Hellboy did some of the artwork for it, and there's some neat. Like in the '90s, there was this kind of idea that like, hey, we're not going to just do 4-color superhero looking stuff. So you get like your Dave McKean style artwork. But then there's just like really bad writing too, just really like shit that just doesn't make any sense. There's a whole subplot about this militia guy, like the Soldier of Fortune character, who sort of like figures out what the Nightbreed are, and he helps one sect of them go try to assassinate Baphomet, because the idea is if Baphomet is gone, there's no law. And if there's no law, the Nightbreed can just eat humans and take over the world. And so the Soldier of Fortune somehow spots the Nightbreed and is like, okay, well, I'm on this team now. And it's never explained. It doesn't make any fucking sense at all. And it's just like that. And even in the newer comic books, it has a really weirdly out of place happy ending. Like there's a happy ending where like the new Midian is absurdly great for the characters that survive.
Cool.
Which is great. But
is it still in Canada?
No, it's on an island, which is kind of interesting. There's a character that's running around that looks like he has like a big weird head. It's like sort of two faces melded together.
He's sort of the Elephant Man?
Kind of, yeah. But
John Merrick.
Yeah, what you can't tell about that character is he's two conjoined twins. And they're both authors. Actually, one of them is an author and one of them is a critic. And they become super famous because some people love the work of the author and some people love the work of the critic. And the critic attacks his brother's work. So they're in the same body. And their sort of literary fame is grown by this beef between the author and the critic, who's actually the same person. And then this is super meta. That character writes a story about the Nightbreed that becomes a popular franchise of movies, and then they make enough money to buy the island that they all live on. It's so bizarre. These side characters write their way out of the problems by turning the story of the Nightbreed in the comic into something that was never able to be in the real world.
Yeah.
You know, and we're entering the world of The Conjuring is now $1 billion franchise.
God damn
you know, and so you'd think that maybe if Clive Barker had been a little more mainstream in some of his choices, that this too could have been that big.
Yeah.
Isn't that wild? The Conjuring is that big.
Is anything good happening in the world right now?
It is pretty gnarly, man. There's a bunch of crazy, wild shit going on.
Well, at least The Conjuring is the worst of it.
I don't know about
It's excessive.
that.
No.
I mean, if this movie was made into a TV show, where do you think they should pick it up? Do you think it should be sort of a direct sequel to the film and new actors playing the characters, or do you think it should follow the rise? I would imagine they would do sort of like the comics, which they have a little bit of prequel, flashback, a little bit of present Midian, and then it walks itself into the new Midian, the search for the new Midian.
I think if it was up to me, I think I would just take that world and do something else with it. Mm-hmm. Like have the possibility of an open storyline. I mean, the quest for Midian could be great. I mean, that could go on for, look at Star Trek Voyager, like Voyager?
Or even Battlestar Galactica. Like
or Battlestar, yeah. It just, searching for something that you're never going to find, you can get a lot of mileage out of that if you just keep deferring success. But it gets pretty unsatisfying after a while, like Lost. But I just sort of feel like there's so much potential in there that it could almost be anything as long as you have the Nightbreed and them as outsiders.
Yeah. Do you think... I mean, Decker is such a cool part of this thing. Like, I mean, it's almost like you would have to start it on that timeline just to take advantage of how cool that character is.
Yeah.
I mean, because you wouldn't want to dump... I mean, most of the fan art involves that character, you know, at this stage. That or Pelican. Those are the two characters that most people draw. And so you would think that those characters would be there again.
Yeah. Decker's a fascinating character. I mean, he's sort of like an inverted Van Helsing, but who's also a serial killer. I mean, he's never explained. It's there's a lot of weak choices in how his character sort of rolls out in this movie. Like, his motivation's never clear. He's just evil or something. Like why he goes to so much trouble to just kill everyone and everything in his path is, and clumsily usually, is kind of weak, but he's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, just definitely. Like, I can't. Yeah, this would have come out after Silence of the Lambs. The book was out, but the whole idea of like a well-dressed doctor who's also a killer. You know, I don't know. I mean, I feel like there's probably some version of that before this, but this is a pretty strong version of that. And you know, it has the really cool house with all the murderous paintings and shit in the background, and this weird room full of knives that are.
That's the most interesting scene in the movie. It's so eerie. The minimalism and clinicalness and the big blown up Xerox copies of some sort of horrifying scene or whatever.
Yeah. And it's in the film, it's not super clear like why he would like immediately go to hating the Nightbreed, because you would think it could go the other way. He could be like, I also am a monster. Yeah. Clearly, these are my people. But he has this whole weird momentary freak out about people's filthiness and dirtiness and stuff. And that's in the comic book. The Cenobites from Hellraiser, their version of hell, their god Leviathan, is actually all about order and the removal of chaos and so
he fits in with them.
So he kind of is more on the Cenobite kick. Like you could see him finding the Le Marchand box and becoming like a Frank character from Hellraiser, or actually even becoming a Cenobite. Like you could easily imagine Decker becoming a Cenobite. That's one of the plots of the it's actually Hellraiser Jihad is what the storyline's called.
Oops.
Yeah. Whoops. But they try to hunt down the Nightbreed because of the last and boldest forces of chaos still left on the earth, and they don't want this like wild, sex positive, magic, crazy, orgiastic death crew running around when they're supposed to be like the people dealing out that shit.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
That's cool.
A bunch of good ideas, and that series has a bunch of terrible writing in it too, which is a shame because there's some really strong ideas in that little comic book series.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this movie really did, and it sounds like the supplementary materials did something similar, really got me to ask a lot of questions about like, well, what's not working here? Mm-hmm. Why not? Like, there's so much cool stuff. But aside from like, oh, that's a clunky line, or that wasn't funny. But in a more general sense, like what is being missed here? Definitely really asks a lot of those questions about what could make this movie better.
I think maybe one of the things that people find satisfying about this film and these stories a little bit is they don't fit neatly into like the narrative structure that we're all familiar with. I mentioned that a little bit earlier, but you know, like Boone, you don't ever really see him saving the day. You know, nobody really wins. Like the bad guys aren't totally overcome at the end, and there's so much that's left ambiguous.
Right.
Like, you know, what's up with this priest? And you know, is he going to keep coming? Is he the new big bad? Why the fuck would he have been momentarily sympathetic to them and then be like, I want to kill them now? It doesn't make any sense. But again, the new comic sort of like retcons a little bit of like where he's coming from. And that character is also a serial killer, which is kind of weird, like in the story. So then, like we talked about, like the improbability of this world. Like, so you have these two, like, so with this retcon of this character's backstory, you're supposed to believe that there are two serial killers present randomly at this event. I mean, it just, come on, it's super stupid.
I think something else that I wish of this film is I wish it was scary. I mean, if I had seen it when I was 12, I'd probably have nightmares because of how disturbing and uncanny the Midians are, but the people in Midian are. But I'm not saying like, well, it's supposed to be a horror film and horror films are supposed to be scary. Therefore, I more mean, I think it would have been a stronger film had it been scary. Had there been more tension.
Or menace, like if the characters were more menacing.
Yeah. And because again, the only menace, at least, we get is actually from Decker.
Right.
And that's why I can imagine, again, the studio going like, we like the slasher guy. Mm-hmm. And it's not just because slashers were hot at that moment. It's kind of the most realized part of the film.
Yeah. If you were to come in and do like a pretty simple nip and tuck and you were to like look at some dailies or whatever from this film, you would look at it and I think pretty quickly identify that Decker is the strongest element of the film.
Yes.
And so when you're like, okay, well, how are we going to fix this? Well, let's dial up the strongest part of this film and dial down the shitty parts of this film, which are the monsters that don't make any sense. And there you go. There's a theatrical cut and the marketing campaign behind it.
Was the priest in the...
He is. And weirdly enough, in the theatrical cut, he actually still has a bowl of Baphomet's jizz or whatever.
Right.
And he like puts it on Decker's chest, and Decker comes back alive. And then Decker is like crucified on this angel in the graveyard. So it's this weird priest sort of bringing back Decker from the dead. And so there's this weird cliffhanger where, okay, are the Nightbreed going to have to deal with like undead Nightbreeded Decker now? I mean, fuck that. You know?
Right.
As far as being afraid of him, I think you might have like, or at least I had the similar experience that Boone has in the director's cut when he wakes up from the dream and they're like dancing at the gates of Midian and having like a super good time. And she asks him like, oh, are your dreams still super shitty? And he's like, oh, actually, I'm starting to like them. And I think, man, if you could jam around with like a sexy porcupine lady and a bunch of murderous mutants and just have a good all the time all night, positive evening, you know? I mean, it kind of reminds me of like going out in San Francisco before the tech boom. You know, just a bunch of weirdos everywhere.
And a little like Hellraiser.
Yeah.
What else we got?
I think we're at the end of this. Okay, so you find yourself at the gates of Midian. You're stumbling through,
knocking over
styrofoam,
you've gravestones.
You've incorporated these tales into your own personal mythology. Pelican bites you. What do you hope your monstrous powers and grotesque manifestation end up being? Like you have powers, and then you're marked by those powers in some way.
I think it's mentioned in the... Is it in the book? But this idea of you humans, when you dream you can fly. Mm-hmm. That's what animals do. That's what monsters do. Something like that. Mm-hmm. You wish you were monsters. You're jealous. Flying would be a pretty nice power because I certainly don't want to suddenly be 700 pounds and my head's coming out of my belly button or something.
You don't know what that guy could do, though. He might have a monstrous dick.
What and what would he do with it?
Well, being that close to it, I mean, who knows? So gross.
That sounds so useless.
Okay, so you're flying. So, okay, but now you're marred by your power. So do you have like leathery wings? You have some sort of like weird shaped face because you can levitate yourself. Like your brain is huge. So like your skull is all
I don't know, can I just
malformed.
turn into smoke or something?
You could turn into smoke, but you still have to pick a negative physical characteristic to represent the power.
Maybe, okay, I can turn into smoke, but it's not a very nice shade of purple. Mm-hmm. It's not like glimmering or glittering.
Right, when you're not smoke, though. Like maybe when you turn into smoke, it's like a fart. Like it's a noxious gas.
Oh.
What does your smoke smell like?
Like angels.
Like pork rinds and Nag Champa?
Nag Champa would be nice.
Yeah, you just like you become a cloud of Nag Champa. That's your monstrous form.
How about you?
I despite having asked it, like I always ask these questions, and you're always like, okay, well, what are you queuing up? I never think about it beforehand, which is probably a fault. I should probably think a little bit cooler. I would probably want to be able to turn into some sort of physically powerful like hybrid monster, like a creature from the Black Lagoon or like a werewolf type of thing. You know, just some sort of I look like myself, I mutant out, and then all of a sudden it's go time. Like,
right. I mean, I guess
claws, teeth, the whole deal.
Yeah. I mean, I guess thinking about it, like as my normal everyday life Mark person, like a power would be something that I would want to be interesting, or I would get to do interesting things. But honestly, if I was one of the breed, it means I'm persecuted and afraid and am a monster by default. So actually probably the best power would be whatever brings the highest kill count. Whatever would be able to defend me and my fellow Midians the most would probably actually be the best power to have. Because otherwise, you're just dead weight to the community.
Yeah. Having
like Babette.
Yeah, worthless. Although she's a telepath. so she might have some.
Yeah, she touches you and you see people getting their heads cut off. That's useful.
Yeah, that's a cool scene that's expanded in the director's cut. Is that whole sort of Inquisition of the Nightbreed?
Yeah,
which I think is a pretty hellish scene. It's pretty good. Like some of the monstrous effects, like the creature that has the fangs and its head has been cut off and it's dying. Like you just wonder, like, whoa, what was that creature?
Yeah,
totally. There's another character that you see. She has like green bumps all over her body, and you see her. She's in the comic book, but in the Nightbreed Chronicles, she hugs the other members of her tribe for the last time, and she believes that she has like their DNA on her, and that when she dies, she'll fall on the ground and they'll grow out of the ground or something like that. There's so many neat ideas.
That's very X-Men.
Yeah, there is a lot of X-Men-ish sort of stuff going on here. And even Charlaine Harris, the woman that wrote True Blood, she sort of has a new series that she had written. There's probably like 10 books of it out already, but it's about a small town where everybody's like a supernatural creature. But they're like monsters and like the vampires and ghosts and shit. But they're more evil, I guess. I don't know. So the whole idea of a team of mutant powered creatures, I don't know. It's cool. But then also corny.
Yeah.
Who do you think would win, the creatures from Monster Squad or the Nightbreed?
Oh, Nightbreed.
Nightbreed.
Well, especially with or without Berserkers. I think even without the Berserkers.
I think you got to go Street Fighter 2. Like, so, you have Wolfman, Dracula, the Mummy, like those 5 classic monsters. Yeah. Now you get to pick 5 Nightbreed.
Oh.
Like, I don't know that anyone...
the big ugly one, the fast one, the quill one, and the, I don't know, one with the hand on her chin. I don't know.
Yeah. Do you think they beat Dracula?
I don't know.
I don't know. I think Dracula beats
because they're all kind of Pelican's basically Dracula, but he's Rastafarian and has snake dreads, right?
Yeah, he's awesome.
Let's fade to black and roll the credits.
All right, Tribes of the Moon.
Subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher. Send us ratings and reviews. Join the mailing list. Love to see you next time for Death Note. Watch it on Netflix. It's coming out any day now.
Yep.
I'm actually kind of excited. The preview, I never watch previews. I never watch trailers, but I did for this for some reason, and it looks really promising.
Yeah. Everybody loves the anime, but, that's anime.
Right.
All right, Creatures of the Night. Check you later.
Thanks for listening.